On 15th March 1938, Hitler had roared. It came in the aftermath of annexing, occupying Austria. A sham referendum playing on nationalistic jignosm, Hitler's roar took the world into a new storm, one that we know as World War II. Fast forward to the present. Last week on 30th September, history was re-repeated when Hitler's doppelganger, Vladimir Putin, roared from the gilded walls of Kremlin's St. George's Hall. A roar for the West, to Ukraine and rest of the world. A roar that could descend the world into another storm. Today, Europe, America, and the world finds itself on the crossroad of history, repeating itself like it had in 1938. As such, the question that stares us all, will we head into the World War-like situation by the end of this year? Will the winters take us into the new World War III? Hi, I'm Shruti Vyas. On 30th September, Putin's roaring speech from Moscow's St. George Hall, where every statue marks a victory, was primarily for the West and its allies. He put on a big performance for the gathered Russian elites and the world listening beyond. Wrapping his words in historic terms, he tried to set the seal of a permanence on the largest land grab in Europe since the Second World War. And he said, and I quote, "I want the Kyiv authorities and their real masters in the West to hear me so that they remember this. People living in Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson and Zaporizhia are becoming our citizens forever." The grand performance was also put on for the Russians in order to rebuild the waning trust and nationalistic zeal, following in the footsteps of Hitler and his 1938 speech, which had mesmerized the Germans more. So while Putin roared, Ukraine immediately applied for a NATO membership. The West too immediately denounced the occupation as an illegal act that no one will recognize. The Americans imposed more sanctions and a vote of condemnation was drafted at the United Nations. Meanwhile, Putin's people, the Russians, they continued to leave the country, indifferent towards Russia becoming a little bit more larger, bigger. But all this did not deter Vladimir Putin. He was filled with pride. Heck, he's still filled with pride. 8 years after annexing Crimea and getting away with it scratch-free, he knows somewhere within that he will succeed once again. Putin's speech on 30th September was parlayed with political rhetorics. He chose the weighted words in a bid to unite his countrymen, but one that could and can also further divide the world. For he scratched open some old wounds. In the fiery speech about Ukraine, the 4 regions which Russia claimed ownership through referendum, he also railed at the West for a litany of sins, ranging from destabilizing Russia in the 17th century to allowing gender reassignment surgery. And he slammed the United States and its allies for colonialist history. He said, and I quote, "They want to see us as a colony. They don't want equal cooperation. They want to rob us. They want to see us not as a free society, but a crowd of soulless slaves." And he vowed to use all means available to fend off attacks, a clear reference to the country's nuclear arsenal. Putin said, and I quote, "They created a precedent, by the way," making a valid reference to his declared readiness to use all means to deter Ukraine from pressing on with its counter-offensive. Yes, that fiery speech was made to remind his people, the world, the atrocities the US had committed, the carpet bombings during the Korean and Vietnam Wars. He roared about US being the only country to use nuclear weapons, dropping them on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the closing days of World War II. Putin also lamented the collapse of the Soviet Union and blamed the West for trying to dominate Russia. We need to turn this disgraceful page. Western hegemony will be smashed. This is inevitable. We must do this for our people, the great historical Russia, Putin had said. In convincing words, Vladimir Putin tried painting West as an aggressive, imperialist based on lies and violence, realizing little that this is exactly what Russia had become under his leadership. All this incessant roar was for his audience, the elite sitting in the hall, and for the people fleeing, reminding them that they are succeeding in knitting back the Soviet dream despite the hardships that are being hurled. So did Putin succeed to sway his people by the means of using such fiery rhetorics in his speech? Well, during Crimea annexion, Putin had carried much of Russia's elite and society with him on a wave of patriotic fervor. Even though the world had frowned at him for naked land grab, many felt Putin had a point. After Iraq and Libya, how could the West lecture others about violating sovereignty? And many European politicians too got back to business as usual with Russia as quickly as possible. But this time, however, the domestic situation is far less favorable for Putin. At the onset of war, Russians were unperturbed, and many stood by the leader and his decision to the act of war. But last week, when people were asked to join the fight against the war in Ukraine, many people started fleeing Russia. Being the first public mobilization since the Second World War, hundreds of thousands of Russians tried to leave the country by land, by air, to Central Asian countries like Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, and to other countries like Finland, Georgia, Mongolia, Turkey, and Serbia. Undeniably, 8 months later, chaos, uncertainty, and terror has gripped Russians. The improvements in quality of life that the first years of Putinism had brought are drying up amid sanctions and international isolation. Russians are gripped with more anxiety than the world. Yes, Putin among his people is fast becoming very unpopular. Unlike 8 years back during the Crimea annexation, this time the Russian elites that had gathered at St. George Hall appeared apprehensive rather than victorious. International media has been quoting that many in the Russian political elite are horrified, gripped with nervousness. An unnamed political insider in venting to the international press had said, and I quote, "Nobody knows what happens next. It's clear there is no grand strategy." Which is also why, in order to coax the public mood, Putin had ordered for the sham referendum in Ukraine. And why is it sham? Well, according to the official figures released by the Kremlin, the percentages of the 4 regions voting to join Russia were 99, 98, 93, and 87%, signaling to the Russians that in mammoth the Ukrainians have voted to be part of Russia. Yes, the Kremlin wanted a resounding pro-Russian verdict that could be dutifully reported through their toolkit on state propaganda networks by their stooges. He used the illusion of democracy to feed the domestic propaganda machine rather than trying to dupe an international audience. As the war shifts against Russia, we will see, and are expected to see, more electoral cosplaying as Putin the autocrat seeks to justify his tyranny with democracy theater. The sham referendum, the numbers, the roar of Vladimir Putin from St. George Hall, citing and quoting history, using words like colonialism, slavery, it was all to quell dissent domestically by reinforcing the official line that Russians are fighting on the side of justice. So has Putin managed to win back his people? Unlikely. And how far will then Putin go? Well, before the sham referendum, the bellow was that Ukraine might just win the war, as Ukraine is fighting head-on, giving a befitting fight. She is and will continue to put a brave fight for the liberation of our areas. The morale of her army, its people, is also very high. While Russian soldiers, well, they're on the run. As such, in such a situation then, the worry becomes, will Putin, in rage of fury and contempt, not fire nuclear missiles at Ukraine? And in case if this does happen, will NATO, the US, not respond immediately in retaliation? The winter is here. Both Europe and Russia will be soon more troubled by high demands and meager supply for fuel and gas. The brutal winter will bring a lot of despair and anger in the people, particularly among the Russians. We already know the mood, particularly in the post-pandemic time, everywhere, including Russia, is not one where people want war, bloodshed, and more fear. And with the use of force to get people to join military forces will only lead to more backlash. People will flee Russia, and an empty, poor, hungry, and sick Russia will not be able to contribute towards becoming the grand Soviet empire of Putin's dream. Therefore, the worry is such mood could vex Vladimir Putin. And if he continues to be so stubbornly evil, pushing the fight and the fighting, will the world not be steered towards the Third World War? Well, uncertainty is looming and it is daunting. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel for all the latest gossip on politics and my take on world affairs.